Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. It's often said that in order to solve problems, you have to wholly understand the issue at hand first. This is a seemingly obvious statement and line of reasoning. However, within this day and age, challenges we face are bountiful and usually quite nuanced. Both the identification of challenge and then the gaining of a deep-seated understanding can require significant amounts of time and effort. To add, sometimes other more glaring or publicly visible matters steal away our attention and leave lesser-known issues unchecked and allowed to rage unabatedly, simply due to our lack of bandwidth. Need an example to make sense of all this? Take our dependence on ink for all sorts of printing needs. Think about how much of that product you encounter on a daily basis, whether it's on a sheet of paper you received or a document you yourself created. Now, consider the amount of ink used in newspapers or prints for clothing, or even tags for said clothing. The volume of that product being used around the world is heavy. The amount of ink that a single person uses and or encounters in a day is a lot. Extrapolating numbers makes this figure almost unfathomable. Yet, this is not a problem on most people's minds, despite the reality that ink is a petroleum product made from crude oil and is most certainly not serving our environmental interests. Are there better ways to tackle this issue? Should we care about this issue? You betcha. Our guest today will fill us in on all of it, on why this particular issue is problematic and what opportunities are out there for us to take a step forward when it comes to working towards more sustainable and responsible models for commerce and industry. Scott Fulbright is a scientist and entrepreneur using algae to make positive impact on our environment. And Scott is the CEO and co-founder at Living Ink Technologies, a biomaterials company turning waste algae into sustainable pigments and inks. He was born and raised in Michigan, but spent summers in California with his grandparents. His grandfather taught him to sail in his early years in Long Beach, California, and this led him to become a lifelong sailor, and more importantly, a sailing instructor on Catalina Island, California, and Block Island, Rhode Island. And being on the water made him instantly fall in love with marine biology, and resultantly, he ended up changing his major at Michigan State University from engineering to marine biology. During college, he ended up working in an ecology laboratory studying the effects algae has on our ecosystems. After graduating, he was hired at an algae biofuels company in West Texas. After 2 years of turning algae into oil, he was accepted into a PhD program at Colorado State University studying cell and molecular biology. During graduate school, Scott became interested in entrepreneurship. The idea of developing a sustainable product and scaling it to make impact was extremely exciting. He skipped an MBA and co-founded Living Ink with the mission of replacing petroleum-based products with algae-based materials for a more sustainable world. Living Ink has developed a carbon-negative black pigment made from algae that replaces carbon black petroleum. His company printed hang tags for Patagonia, boxes for Adidas, and shirts for American Eagle. They even put the pigment into cosmetics packaging for beauty counters and a bioresin for an electric motorcycle called Terraform. With all that stated, Scott, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks for having me, Christopher. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, really excited to get into all of this. Quite fascinating what you do, and I think listeners are really going to enjoy it all. So yeah, it's going to be a good talk, I have a feeling.
Sounds good.
Why don't we get into it? The first segment is something called Coloring Wikipedia. And this is a segment where I just basically read off a definition of what the guest does. I do it for a couple of reasons. One, to bring everybody up to speed. And then two, it's kind of a nice jumping off point where we can kind of look at the profession, look at the job. And sometimes there's elements within Wikipedia that they sort of underrepresent or just flat out just ignore. And I think it's always interesting to get that perspective from the guests themselves. So I do have you down here for ecopreneur. And I'm just going to read that off. And while you're listening, maybe you can just consider what you do at Living Ink Technologies, and then I'll ask you to comment after. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right, here we go. Ecopreneur. Ecopreneurs are entrepreneurs whose business efforts are not only driven by profit, but also by a concern for the environment. Ecopreneurship, also known as environmental entrepreneurship and eco-capitalism, is becoming more widespread as a new market-based approach to identifying opportunities for improving environmental quality and capitalizing upon them in the private sector for profit. There it is, a bit of a mouthful, stumbled through it a little bit, but yeah, what do you think within the context of what you do and your company does?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly that's a good definition of kind of an entrepreneur focused on sustainable efforts. When my co-founder and I started Living Inc., that's why we did this, was just saying, like, looking at the world and saying everything's made from petroleum, and that we, regardless of all the other negative issues related to petroleum, it's a finite material, and we're using it up so quickly that when people always ask me, are biomaterials the future? They have to be, because we will run out of oil. And so that's why we started Living Inc. And so I think that definition is spot on. We've always been focused on the mission. And in the last couple of years, we've had to really kind of focus on the business model and the economics, because that's what makes it work. But it's always been about making an impact. We've had numerous pivots, because the first product we ever did was really creative and neat, but it wasn't making that eco impact that we really wanted to make. And so that's always been a huge driver. And I think what's nice about ecopreneurship is that times have changed, even in the last 6 months, 12 months, right? Where all of a sudden, like, this is starting to become a little bit on the normal side of, like, even these huge publicly traded companies are now reporting their ESG, so their environmental metrics to their board, and they're getting pressured to report that and improve. So I think that's been a really great thing on the ecopreneurship side, is that, in the next 5 years, everyone might have to kind of be a little bit of an ecopreneur.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's for me as well, as one of the things that kind of gives me hope, is that grilling, what you're just saying, is that if companies aren't prepared, if they don't have answers for some of these things, some of their activities, they're going to be called out. There's enough of, there's enough movements that are kind of gaining steam, especially with youth too. I mean, for them, I think coming up, I mean, they just expect that. And if it's not there, then that's a major issue. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
I think there's, just going off of that, I think what's been interesting at some of the conferences I've been at recently is they're getting this consumer pressure to do things, but they're also getting this, like, the highest level pressure, which is some of their investors, right? So when you have like BlackRock and Goldman Sachs, and they're starting to talk about this, which I don't think they did that long ago, right? All of a sudden there's this sandwich effect. If you got consumers saying this and you've got your investors saying this, and actions will be made when everyone that's either paying you or investing in you is asking you to do things differently. So I'm actually more hopeful right now than I've ever been, and I'm a scientist by training, which means I'm a skeptic. So that's good.
Right. That's saying something then, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, returning to the definition, was there anything that you felt was missing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the other things that, I think that covers it relatively well. I do think the other thing that we have to think about as a society and everything that we buy or use is people, so the triple bottom line here. So you've got planet, you got people, and we got profit. And so in order to function and have a financially sustainable business, you got to make money. We got to take care of the environment and make the right decisions there the best that we can. And then, I also think people, and I think, the environment and people kind of go hand in hand, of how we treat people, how we treat the environment around the people that are buying these products or making these products. So I think there's, that triple bottom line mentality is, I think, again, becoming more and more interesting to people and caring more about it.
Well said. Okay. In terms of Living Inc., how long have you guys been operating for now?
So we started the company in 2014, actually, as grad students, and my co-founder and I would throw out bad ideas left and right every day. And then, after 3 years of bad ideas, you get one, you go, oh, there might be something there. So yeah, 2014, and had multiple pivots since then.
Okay, excellent. Now, as far as that goes, I mean, you've been at it for a little while. What would be a typical day, week, or even month with where you're at this point in its development?
Right now, it's a really fun time, because when you have an idea and no one knows about it in the world, and then a few more people learn about it, right now we've been launching different products. We've been in the media a little bit. And so like for me, I do a lot of calls with brands every day, other factory partners. So whether that's printers or packaging groups or textile groups, other supplier partners, so people that grow algae or other materials. So I'm talking to a lot of people all day, trying to make things work, trying to find those opportunities to grow faster and bigger. And then, my team at Living Ink, we're always developing new ink formulations, better understanding the pigment that we've been developing, working with certification bodies. So there's various certifications that certain brands need that we have to kind of submit samples and have some heavy duty testing. So I always say, we're still a very small company for how many kind of global brands we're working with right now. But sometimes my co-founder will call me and say, how's it going? And I'll just say, it's bizarre, the number of things I've done today that are so different.
Right, right. Well, it must
Which is
keep it
fun
all
for me.
interesting. Yeah, it must keep it all
Yeah,
interesting all the same, right?
exactly. Wearing many hats, even within the same hour, let alone the same
Yes.
day and week. So yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Here's a question for you in regards to that, a bit of a follow-up. Say within the last 3 years or so, what would be the ratio of calls that say you'd be doing going out to say brands and trying to like,
Mhm.
get their attention and inform them and educate them and basically sell your product to them versus
Yeah.
now where maybe some of these calls are coming, they're inbound, they've heard about you and they're coming in. How has that shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a great question because, yeah, when you have that idea and you say, "Oh, I think we have a product," right? Well, how do you like let people know about that? And I used to like, you know, wonder like why are marketers so important or why do they get historically paid so well? And it's like because it's like without, it's a very science-minded person to say, "Here's my product. It's so great. It's going to change the world," and like no one knows about it and it doesn't go anywhere and it makes no impact. So
Right.
to answer your question, yeah, I mean, probably 3 years ago, I was going to every accelerator program I could or conference that I could talk to just to kind of get it out there. And, right now we have one person that's just committed to like every day, like emailing, recording the inbound emails and responding and setting up phone calls. So
Yeah.
that's become a full-time job, and we need to hire some more people just to kind of manage all of that incoming. So it changed dramatically, and every project launch we do stimulates more and more interest and more validation that one, the
Right.
technology is real, we can deliver it, there's a story, and it's sustainable. So yeah, it's really taken off in the last several months, really starting with COVID. And to be honest with you, COVID, I think, changed the game in some of this because we were starting to talk to designers from brands that said, historically, I traveled the world to all these factories, but because there was this
Right.
shutdown in travel, they said, I'm at home right now and I'm thinking about the future for the first time. I'm not worried about this quarter or this season.
Mm,
And so we got like, I kind of thought things were going to get tough there in March 2020, April 2020. And it just took off. Like starting then, it was just off to the races with interest. So it's been awesome.
that's a really interesting point. Yeah, it's one that I hadn't really considered.
Mhm.
It kind of gave, I mean, that period so unique, obviously in human history, but I mean, it gave it a pause basically on everything and a lot of reflection. And of course, I mean, it makes sense that that reflection would have extended into the business and professional worlds and given people opportunities to really consider a lot of these issues and what they could do, different possibilities. And yeah, actually, the way you just spelled it out, it makes sense why that would have occurred, but it's not something I would have really considered without you sort of like giving that prompt on that. So that's really
Yeah,
quite
yeah. I think people
fascinating.
personally and professionally took on new projects that they would have never taken on without
Yeah.
that odd time in life.
Yeah, 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 totally. All right. Well, maybe we can shift into a new segment here, a Q&A discovery, and basically a back and forth. We can continue this. I do have some questions lined up for you here. And the first one is pertaining to a bit more of your backstory. I mean, off the top, I kind of gave listeners a bit of an overview, where you came from as far as like that pure scientific background, academia, and working for companies yourself. But maybe you could kind of, add a little bit more to all of this, to that story
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how you end up where you are, whether it's geographical or career wise. And, I've always loved science. Like you mentioned in the opener, I love marine biology. When you're on the water and you're sailing and you see dolphins and sharks and sea turtles, I mean, it's just fascinating to me how that ecosystem works.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that kind of directed me in a certain way is like, I really grew up in the middle of Michigan, right? So, I wanted to study marine biology, but I'm in the middle of the Midwest. Like there's no oceans. There's
It's a
not a
bit
lot
tricky.
there. It's a bit tricky, right? And so what do you do when you study marine biology at Michigan State? It's you study algae blooms, and
Fair
uh,
enough. Yeah.
and that got me into the algae world. My first like job while I was going to school in a lab, and I just remember we were going and we were studying why the algae was growing so fast. And I remember just, there's two moments. I remember driving home from one of the field sites that we were at, just going like, how do you turn a problem into a solution, right? This stuff's growing so fast. It must be good for something if you can domesticate it or you can control it, right?
Yeah.
And then the other moment I remember is I was like looking under a microscope during like one of the home football games. I probably should have went to the football game, and I was actually under the microscope on like a Saturday night. And I was just like, it was so fascinating because you'd get, it's like meditation. You'd look under the microscope
Yeah.
and you'd enter this microscopic world. And it was like leaving your current world that you were in. And you would
Mm,
see like these algae cells floating around, and you'd see these like predators coming, starting to eat the cells, and these other things turning like, well, what is all this and
what's going
what's
on
going
here?
on? And I just remember like saying like someday I want to like turn this stuff into something that's valuable to society that makes the world a better place because it's just so cool. And so I would have never thought that I'd be talking about ink or packaging or textiles with
Right.
brands, but that's the fun part of career paths.
Yeah, yeah, totally. So it was in those moments essentially that like, those seeds of sort of like, I don't know, that entrepreneurial spirit were kind of like sort of forming in a sense. You're already sort of having visions of maybe, going off on your own at some point, perhaps, is what you're saying.
Yeah, those seeds were always there. Like I don't think I really knew
Mm,
it. Like I think I was saying that to myself. After college, I didn't have a job lined up right away, but after a month, I one of the people that I worked with in this algal lab got a job at a biofuels company and said, "Hey, come down to Texas and let's grow algae and make oil for biofuels." And I said, "That sounds like the best job I could ever imagine,"
right.
from so many different levels. And so that was, my dad was actually a professor at Michigan State. And so I grew up in this world of science in a very fortunate way where I could go into his lab and do things and I could hear about science and be around it. But, and I really respect basic science that leads to tons of breakthroughs. But I just remember for me, I love that applied side of science of like not just writing a paper and saying, here, science community, read this work I've been doing,
Yeah.
but like I want to see it, I want to feel it, I want the general public to be able to experience what we're developing. And that's always been deep in me. So that first job doing biofuels said, oh, you can actually go raise private investment, which can fuel research. It doesn't have to be a government grant. And you can actually try to turn it into a business to kind of do this ecopreneurship, which is like you fit into the capitalistic society while having a product that's sustainable. So that first experience drove that home for me.
Yeah, it must have just opened up everything, opened that world
It
up
was
and just possibilities and everything associated
exciting.
with
Like
that.
it's just, yeah, just exciting, right? Science is exciting in its own way. And then to go, oh, like you can just do this. And, and my father-in-law has a business in Connecticut, and his family's always been kind of entrepreneurs. And I remember I was talking to him when I was younger, and he's like, you can just go start any organization you want. You have an idea, you can just go start an organization, do that. And my dad being a professor was like, he did that for 35 years, which is like you get your career path and you go down there. And
Right.
I was talking to my father-in-law, and I'm like, oh, like I didn't really ever think that you could just go do that. That seems almost impossible. And then you realize it's like very possible for anyone
Mm,
to do it.
right, right,
Not to
right.
say it's easy, but it's very, very possible.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, okay. No, that's really interesting. All right, well, I'd like to shift into another question here, actually. And this is something that's kind of a continuation. I mean, we've been speaking about the algae, and then you've built a life off of this, basically.
Yeah.
And when I was researching for this, I found a few blurbs on your website that were pretty interesting. I'd like to share this with listeners as well. And then maybe after I read this off, you could comment on it and maybe add some context to it all here. So let me just read this here. So this is in regards to algae. At large scale production, algae black pigments are carbon negative. Algae absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide, and living ink locks that carbon into the bio-based black pigment for over 100 years. Every 45 pounds or 20.4 kilograms of algae ink we produce keeps 22.5 pounds or 10.2 kilograms of petroleum, crude oil from being used. And that means that 22.5 pounds or 10.2 kilograms of oil can't negatively impact our environment or our air. Additionally, because our ink is carbon negative, using a 45 pounds or 20.4 kilogram bucket of algae ink can remove 59 kilograms of carbon dioxide, which would be the equivalent of planting 4 trees. That kind of blew me away. It really kind
Yeah.
of like drove things home as well. But yeah, maybe you could add to that a little bit.
Nice. I'm glad it resonated with you. Where we need to
Totally.
improve our storytelling and marketing, but the facts are true, and it's I mean that's the thing that again it's been various epiphanies throughout the journey, right? Like, okay, what can you use algae for? Like, oh, well, maybe you can use them for pigments that are green or black or color. Okay, well then how do you make it so it fits into the real world printers? And one of these epiphanies that we had was with a professor at Colorado State University, where we said, let's do a carbon life cycle analysis. And he starts to like look at the analysis, and he's like, this is how you make a carbon negative material is you use a photosynthetic organism, whether it's algae or plant that uses basically sunlight as solar energy and removes CO2. And then you go through our process to lock that carbon up. And I remember talking to him, he's like, this is actually exciting, he doesn't always see good results on life cycle analysis because it's difficult, because every time you use any energy to do anything, that all goes into that calculation. So
Right. Of course.
I
Yeah.
think what's interesting about this is that my take on the way that the world operates is that we should always just buy less, use less, drive less, and that's always been my mentality, and I think that's probably a good high level mentality. But when you start to get into carbon negative materials, the more of that material that you use, the better it is, right? So when we start saying, oh, we're going to start using a lot of this algae pigment to put as a pigment in a car bumper, for example, like that's beneficial on the carbon side of things. And I think that starts to get really exciting to me. We're like, the more of this you use, the better. So the way that I have been talking to brands about this is, rather than running your business and making your products and going out there saying, let's go buy some external carbon credits, let's start looking at supply chains of all these brands, plugging in carbon negative materials so that you don't need to go buy some random carbon credits, but you're saying, I made X amount of iPhone cases, and by doing that, I removed X amount of metric tons of carbon dioxide. All of a sudden, like the system starts to look really different, I would say.
Yeah. Not only that too, I think from a consumer perspective as well, I think that's a clear sort of idea for people to understand, to wrap their minds around, rather than this whole carbon credit. I mean, obviously that program can work and does work to a certain extent, but I think it's still unclear, for an average consumer who doesn't really fully embrace or fully understand, and then in effect maybe doesn't fully embrace it, right, as an accepted ideology. Whereas what you were just explaining, that's something that is simple and straightforward. Well, here's a product. Well, X amount of this product was produced from a product that is, that can be reused or is grown as regenerative in essence. And I think that it would probably, again, this is outsider's perspective, but would resonate a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that, part of this scientists historically haven't been great at this, but it's like, it is being creative, and it's not just doing it, but it's like storytelling, right? And trying to and that gets, you start talking, you're going into various disciplines, right? Marketing, innovation, science. I mean, there's just a lot of, and then you got the real world, like production and purchasing departments. Like it's all involved in doing this and making it happen, which is the complex part. I think what's really encouraging is that you're starting to see groups do this and starting to tell that story and getting better at it. No one wants to make claims that are not true. And I think people are being very cautious on that. And we're working with brands where I think they're very cautious, and they're right to do so, right? We don't want that to be said. I will say that just by getting that concept across to people, whether it's going to save the world with our black pigment or not, I mean, there's nothing that's going to just save that, and that solves everything. It's going to take a lot of it's going to take a little of a lot of things, And so, when we first talking about ink, we're talking about ink. They were saying, does that really have impact? And it really does, because everything's at such a large scale. And and even like the toothbrush that I use, it's all plastic. The bristles, even there's petroleum in the toothpaste. I mean, everything, right? So everything needs to be tweaked. So I never belittle anyone, even if I see someone making something that's super small, that's sustainable, and there's a great story. I'm like, that's awesome, because I think the other thing that people and brands don't always realize is that every company at least most of the ones that I know in our shoes have a really big vision in a couple of years, maybe 10 years, because it takes time to do these things. But you have to start somewhere. Like I was just at this conference and this group was talking about making a record, like a vinyl record from like 100% like sustainable like plastic material. And I just thought it was great because I know that entrepreneur and I know the vision is to like completely change the way the world's done. He's just starting with skis and vinyl records because it's a very cool story that gets people engaged.
Right. Yeah.
So it's got to start somewhere and then it gets bigger and bigger.
No doubt. Well, this might be a nice point to segue into another question. It is kind of connected here, and it's in relation to, I guess, like the phrasing and terminology surrounding all of this and these ideologies. And sustainability is a word that's been used over and over, and some might even say it's getting a little bit worn out to a certain extent. But there's been some buzzier words, circular economies, regenerative approaches that are kind of gaining traction. But I think where those are at is not everyone is fully, clued into what they mean. In terms of, say, circular economies, I think that one is quite interesting. And I presume, Living Ink fits nicely into all of that. But maybe it'd be interesting to hear it from you.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think, the challenge that we have at Living Ink is you were always trying to talk to people at the level that they're at. So if we're talking to you as a brand, sometimes if you're talking to sustainability, like they know all the terms and they want to hear it. You're talking to someone else and they're like, don't use that term because I don't know what that is. And so we're always trying to figure out who our audience is and what they want to hear and what they understand. I do think sustainability is very nuanced, right? We could have a whole hour conversation about what does sustainability mean, because we used to call up a brand and say, what are your sustainability initiatives? And they would say, I don't really know. And I'd say, well, you've got biodegradability, you've got compostability. Do you care about carbon? Do you care about water, biodiversity? Right. And then we have to go and be like, oh my gosh, like that's so much to think about.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's overwhelming, even as a technical person who thinks about these things, to be like, well, what should we care about? At Living Ink, we've tried to avoid saying green or eco-friendly or even, sustainable at times, because our message right now is about carbon. We feel like that's the number one priority that groups care about and maybe should care about. We've tried to keep that concise. We're also using waste products, and it's all bio-based. So there's all these kind of buzzwords that we can use, but identifying like what's the most concise and honest way to talk about it. But I do think, I see these new products released and it always says eco product something or sustainable. And I'm always wondering like what was tweaked to make that truly eco or sustainable? Like what is it, and it gets very complex very quickly.
No, most definitely.
I think circular economy is great. And the reason I like circular economy is it makes all of us think about what does a circular economy mean? And if that phrasing alone makes people think about where the stuff that they use comes from and where it goes, then that's a pretty good thing to think about. Even when I used to fill up my car with gas, I used to say like, where did these molecules come from, like in the last year, and where do they come from? Where were they 100 million years ago? Like what were they? Were they algae that were, and I mean, it blows my mind, but you start thinking about circular economy, it makes you think about every molecule that you touch throughout your day.
Yeah, exactly. I was just speaking about all of this with another guest recently, a VC fund, and he was explaining, circular economies, and we were talking about this point of how the linear economy, which is what we're basically in, is relatively new, 70, 80 years. And, like our grandparents would never like, I'm just going to go buy some fast fashion, t-shirts. I'll wear them 3 times and then throw them out. That ideology just did not exist. And it's funny how in this short span of time, literally 70, 80 years, we have shifted and we've gone all in on it. And it's reprehensible is what it really is, to be honest. Right. I mean, we need to get back to that sort of model of like, well, okay, if we're going to use it, one, we should keep it going as long as it can. And then how can we reuse it? How can we repurpose it? And that's basically, for listeners who don't know, would be kind of the distinction between, say, a linear economy, which is just, you're not using it very often, it's into the garbage almost immediately, versus circular as these products, these things that that we consider from the get-go, how they're produced, the materials that are within them, and then how we can, continually use them once they break down, recycle them, reuse them. I'm probably slaughtering this definition here, but I think listeners are probably getting the idea here.
I mean, the two things that come to my mind there is my grandparents. they didn't think of any of this as a sustainability thing, but they were alive when there was wars, where you recycled every piece of rubber and aluminum and you
Yeah.
reused everything, and if the shirt ripped, you would sew it, so you fix it. Like, that was that generation, and then we're not there right now. I mean, and so it's just really interesting when exactly what you said, when you think about even generation ago, 2 generations ago, like, it was just such a different world and how things were
Yeah.
packaged and delivered. And the other thing that comes to mind that I've been thinking about a lot is that I know there's groups working on this right now, but what if you talk to like um, uh, like a manufacturing company that manufactured like laundry machines, and you said that, like, when the life of this is done, you have to take it back and you have to make those parts work in your other systems. Like there's just ways that you could set up the system, and it's complex because there's a lot of stakeholders in this. But I don't think that even companies right now are they don't have to deal with the downstream repercussions of a product that's built to not fit into that circular economy. So you have a washing machine that's not designed the right way. Well, the whole thing goes in the landfill, for example, versus, hey, this is really easy to use the parts that are still good and replace the one part that's needed. So it's such a systemic. I mean, there's these systemic changes that are needed, and then there's these short term kind of like, what can we do in the short term while these bigger political things are figured out.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating to kind of like dive into it all. And the point at which we're at, yeah, again, returning to that point of like how things change so rapidly within 2 generations, moving away, from that ideal of reusing basically and fixing things up to where we're at right now, or just use it a few times, throw it out.
Yeah.
I think what gives me hope is that we weren't that far off. We're not that far removed from that ideology. Now, the point of all of this now is to kind of return to that. And, it is picking up steam. I mean, the fact that we're having a conversation about this right now, obviously we're not the only 2 people on the planet that are thinking about this, right? I mean, there's several people, and obviously with the industry that you're involved with, there's a lot of chatter, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of companies that are trying to like scheme ways of building this into their plans. But you're right. I mean, it's going to take a lot more than just even companies. We need policy. We need, incentives from governments to kind of, push these sort of ideologies along. But I think there is some hope there when we do consider it all.
There's tons of hope. I think I'm working with designers right now at some brands that like give me hope to say, okay, they get to orchestrate what the product looks like. What is it made out of, right? And there's always these logistics and scale questions, but like the companies themselves are showing promising trends, and then the individuals within those companies are really driving a lot of this. I think, right? Or this is what I want to do, and this is the projects I want to do. And I've even heard designers say, like, a couple years ago, I didn't have this much freedom to do what I'm doing right now, right?
Wow.
To design these different materials that they're using. So I think there's a lot of hope there. I think that I think more than ever, but I think it takes all these stakeholders, right? It takes government, it takes corporate, it takes innovators, startup companies, consumers to actually care. And then for like people in creative and marketing to like help tell these stories, to communicate. I mean, it all comes back to communication and really education. Like, we've been talking in the cosmetics industry, and I said, carbon black, which is the black pigment we're replacing, that's made from heavy petroleum, is still in a lot of cosmetics. And when I tell people that, they're like, really? Like, I put that right next to my eye. That's why, like, and these are people that have used that product a long time, right? So it's a lot of education, communication, and I think you're spot on. All these conversations, all these podcasts are really helping stimulate the conversation, education.
Agreed. As far as I guess that point you just raised about brands and some of the reactions to some of the things that you just raised, when they hear about your product, say for the first time, what's the reaction like? Maybe you could kind of like consider that from 2-3 years ago versus say present day.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's I think that one of the things that I've realized in this journey, it comes back to communication, is showing what the product like is. And so one of my if I could give any advice to people with an idea, it's to, even if it's a drawing, like mock it up, like this is the vision, right? Because I don't think we were so deep into like, can we de-risk this? Can we make it work? And the technology side, we kind of like ignored like, here's the vision, right? And you got companies that can do, typically technical founders like we are, you dive in the technology and you prove it out. And then you have groups who are more on the creative side that say, I got this whole pitch deck of great images about the future of what we're going to do. And then there's somewhere in the middle. So you kind of want to be working on technology, but you also want to like tell a great story.
That fine
Because
balance,
the first, yeah, exactly. And like we were making this black liquid saying, we're making ink, this is great. And everyone's like, I don't know what do you mean? Like, what are you making? And then we printed it on our first box for packaging and we showed people the package and everyone's like, oh, now I get what you're doing, and they just had to see that final product. And that goes for anything, it's like once we do it an application, it's one thing to say we can do foam in your sole of your shoe. And people go, okay, if you show them that prototype, they go, oh, that's what it is, and it seems simple, but we're all very visual. We all like to see something and touch it. So, exactly. We send samples out all the time. Like, hey, we sell black ink that's more sustainable than ink that's already out there. And then people say, well, can you send me some samples? And we say, yeah, and it's going to look like black ink, but people, they love it. They need to see it. They want to feel it. They want to smell it. Right. So, we've come a long ways on the different applications, the different kind of samples that we can have. And then every brand project we work with, and this is where I think these brands and designers, I think have a lot of power in this movement that we're talking about, because, the first Patagonia project that we did was like 10,000 prints. And so, in general, we probably sold like $80 worth of ink for that project or something like that. But the power that had to show, it's a real product. It worked with the printer. It cleaned the same. It was less scary for other groups to start to use. And so that's what I keep telling these brands is don't think about this huge overhaul of your global black ink for us. And we change on 100 metric tons. Like, let's pick a project. Let's knock it out. Let's be successful, build trust. And then if you love it, we'll go on to the next one and then other groups can do it. So we kind of have that incremental approach. So I think people thought it was interesting 3 years ago. I think people say, how do I get a sample? And, how do I get going on this? This is really not only interesting, but tangible.
Yeah. One of the reasons for that question, I was curious about, I guess the awareness, from these brands themselves and how that might have changed, say, within 3 years to where we're at right now. Because there's been a lot that's going out there, and obviously with social media and content, everyone's returning to this point of stories, right? Getting things out and positioning too. And I think it's almost, we're reaching that point. And I think we've also spoken about this, is where people are starting to demand it. They want to know what their brands are doing, their favorite brand, and if it aligns with their values or not. So I was curious whether or not, say within 3, 4, 5 years, if you'd noticed, a lot more general awareness from these brands themselves. And then also even just like the types of questions that they're asking you and, like their interest levels maybe shifting and changing out of necessity, or just, having some time to pause and rethink things.
Yeah, it's that's a great angle on that question of, I think it's been massive in terms of the amount of energy. I used to have to seek, going off one of your first questions, I had to seek someone like, hey, find a packaging person at some brand, be like, do you think about ink? They're like, no. Like, okay, well, what? And then what is ink? Literally, like, can you explain what ink is? Which I thought I was an outsider in the ink world, and then I had to explain what ink is to the packaging person in the industry for a while. But it's, they're busy. They're doing all sorts of these different things.
Right.
The factories typically would deal with the ink, and I would say that there's been a huge amount of energy and genuine learning and people reaching out to me saying, I just want to learn what's right to do and what's not right to do. How do we do better? What's feasible? So a ton of interest, everything from ink to pigments and all these other materials, right? Like I can start pitching my materials, and then next thing I know, I'm like, hey, I should connect you with one of my friends doing this other group, because if you're interested in that material. And so, it's a lot of interest all across the board. And I think that these innovation groups have really grown in the brands to say, we got to start trying these new materials. I don't think that was necessarily the case like 5-10 years ago. It was just kind of like, we do what we do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's kind of what I suspected. And again, that's just one of the things that gives me hope personally moving forward. It is just that. It's just that. Okay. As far as that goes, I mean, you already brought this up, Patagonia. I mean, that must have been a special moment in your company's sort of, history in essence. I mean, they're one of the champions of the environment, more or less you could consider them the king of that within consumer goods and really building that into their model. Now, when they give you that unofficial stamp of approval, what was that like? What was that like?
Yeah, no, it's a great feeling. It's one of those things where I mean, they really were great to work with as expected, and they really pushed it through. And, even some of the partners that were working on the project, like, the brand really has a lot of the control because they're the ones, typically paying for things to get done. So they tell their partners, hey, I want to get this done. And, when you work with this, at that point, we were definitely a smaller company in Denver, and, all of a sudden we're working in like, global supply chains, and getting through compliance and all these things. It's a lot of work on probably their end and our end and the partners end. But it was a very special moment because, I think that anyone that spends years of their life working on something, it's like seeing it in the real world. It's like one of those moments where you're like, oh, like this is, pretty cool. And, I know there's one more question maybe coming up about this, but it's just, I think that the moment of working with Patagonia was awesome, just to engage and say, oh my gosh, they're actually interested to using it, and seeing it actually work and pass the trials and be on something. It was, super special personally and professionally.
I bet. All right. One last question actually within this segment here, and it's kind of returning back to the beginning here, your years in academia, working within companies, and then shifting over into this world of entrepreneurship, and you've spoken to this point already, wearing several different hats in one day. What has that been like? Maybe you could look at it from two angles. Like one, like what are the best parts about it? And then the flip side, or you can go in reverse. Maybe let's go in reverse. Let's end on a positive here in terms of this question. Some of the challenging aspects of that for you.
Yeah. I think the challenging aspects is I love learning. Like I grew up in a family of like public educators. Like we were always like learning, and like having like our dinner conversations were like learning, and like having like tough critical conversations about the world. Right. Like I love it. And we had the first priority we ever came up with at Living Inc. was if we learned one thing a day, it's a successful day. And if you do that year after year, you're learning a lot of things. Right. I think wearing the many hats means that you're really like not that great at any of them, but like you're okay at like a lot of them, So for me, it's like, the drinking from a fire hose, I always like kind of laugh at, because it's just this knowledge coming at you and you're having to learn all these things so quickly. And I think I love learning. When you learn too much at one time, it starts to become overwhelming.
True enough.
And like, what is the priority? You can make a case that there's 4 equally important priorities in one day, and they're all like maybe a little outside of your wheelhouse. The one thing that we've kind of gotten better at is not doing everything ourselves, which we did for a long time, but going out and finding the resources that are available to say, hey, we're not great storytellers. Let's go find someone that can help us do that. Hey, we're not great at doing compliance. Let's go find someone that we can work with that can help with all the safety data sheets and things like that. That's helped mitigate the challenge there.
Okay. What's been kind of the I don't know, the joyous moments, or what are the most joyous moments for you in running this company?
Yeah. Well, I think that part of the joy is learning, right? I love learning new things. I love meeting new people. I love thinking about things that I've never thought about, right? And almost like every week I get off a call and go, I've never thought about that problem, or I've never thought about that industry. And I love it. I go into factories that are printing things, and I'm like, this is crazy to see how the real world works, right? Like I kind of know how science works in some ways, but even then science blows my mind, where I go to a conference and hear about something like that's crazy.
It's always changing, and I thought I knew it. It's
right?
You think you've got to figure it out, and then new tech comes along and just makes what you just learned obsolete, and there's something completely brand new. So
I know. So that's part of the joy, though, is learning all these different things, getting I would have never thought that I could like manage my own accounting books for a couple of years. I don't do that anymore, but like I loved going into QuickBooks. I mean, like I get to like figure out these different categories. Like I learned, like now that I don't love it, I liked it, I got okay at it, and I said it's awesome. So now what does it take to run a company? I've kind of done everything it takes to do it, and I'm average at all of them probably. But one of the joyous moments in terms of just like moments that I can remember, and I think one of them was there's been a lot that have been these inflection moments, but one of the biggest one I think is we worked with this printer called Eco-Enclose in Colorado, who was our first great partner. We called them up, talked to one individual who's like, I pitched them on like, would you ever use a more sustainable ink? And they're like, oh, we're pretty happy with what we have, and our supplier said, okay. I went on LinkedIn. I found the owner of the business, and I, kind of gave him my pitch on LinkedIn, and he said, "Call me when you have a second." So I called him. He's like, "Come in today and run your ink if you can." And he said, we have to be the leaders in innovation and sustainability, and we want to work with groups like you who are pushing on that edge, which is a very, very unique stance when it comes to a production factory that gets paid to just move volume and do things, right? And so he got us going and doing tests, and then he got us onto a brand called Bedrock Sandals, which is this really cool sandal company in the US. And I remember hearing that, like, oh, they might be in REI stores around here. And in Denver, there was the flagship REI store. So I went down one day, and I went down there, and I'm like looking for, I think they had the sandal on display. I'm like, "Hey, do you have the box for these?" And they're like, "Yeah, they're in the back." So they bring the box out, and I'm like,
I'm not really interested in the sandal. I'm just really curious about this box here.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, I'm like taking a picture with it, because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, that's that entrepreneurial moment of like all this hard work and brainstorming and trial and tribulation, and like it's the ink on the box that's in the REI store, and I'm talking to the person, and I'm like, this isn't even my sandal product. It's not even my cardboard product. I didn't even print the material. I'm not even the factory. Like, that's the molecules of ink that we made that are on the box, So, but yeah, I mean, I think that's when these switches go off in your head of like, oh, like this is happening. We can do this, and this is just kind of the start of the vision that we have. So that was one of those real moments.
Yeah, cool. Well, on the heels of that, I mean, that's a really nice story. We do have a segment here in the middle called a water cooler story segment, and maybe I could ask you to share one more if you got it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I did that recently at the Patagonia store, where I was like a proud parent. Same kind of story where I go in the store and I'm like looking around, and I'm looking at what year the tag was printed. I'm like 2018. I don't think they were using us by then. Then I find one in like 2022. I'm like, oh, I think this is us. And I'm like looking,
this is ours.
And yeah, exactly. And
got the little selfie with the hang tag there.
yeah, exactly. And the store, manager's like walking around, and I'm like, this is my company's ink, and she's like, what? Like, tell me, like, what, And I'm like, yeah, we turn algae into ink, and this is the ink that you're all using here. And she's like, and it's a biased crowd, but she was like, that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. Like, tell me more about this. And very Patagonia interaction. So yeah, that kind of moment. I think I think that those are two of the high points. But there's been a lot of moments where we made a screening, and we actually just launched a screening product with American Eagle and Marmot, and then just this week Nike. And nice. There was a moment where we went in to develop that ink on like a Saturday morning, and we're like, is this going to work? And like, what, you're always thinking, am I wasting my time, or is this worth pursuing? It's always the question. And I remember we made up some ink, we printed it, and we stuck it in this little tiny oven that was definitely not meant to like cure ink for screen printing. And like the shirt kind of caught on fire. We like brought it out of the oven, and then we're like feeling it, and we're like, well, I think it's sticky, I think it's working, and that was one of those moments in product development going like, I know what the vision is of this product. I know that this can be something, but you got to start somewhere, and this is like the start. That's a very real start. So yeah, those are some of the moments that stick out in my head.
Yeah, those are cool. Really cool, actually. Yeah, thanks for sharing those.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are running.
Can I say one more? I know we're running out of time. One more, but yeah. So this is just interesting from an innovation and kind of collaboration standpoint. But the first screen print we ever did, we had an ink that would actually grow over time to start living ink. Oh, wow. It was a complex product. It was like living cells, and we worked with this designer. His name was Jared. And he just said, what screen printing is? Like, I really think this would be cool for screen printing. And I'm like, I don't think you understand what we do. We do this living ink kind of thing. It grows. And he just finally gave me the screen and the squeegee and said, just go play around in the lab. And it was like super late one night. And before I left, and I mix up some of this algae, and I make it kind of thick, and I add some things, and I put it through the screen, and I lift up this screen, and it was this, I don't even know what the screen thing was. It was like a picture of like an old man's face or something. And I lifted up the screen, and I was like, oh my gosh, like that's a print. And I'm not a designer or a printer, but I'm like, that's a print. Like it worked, And so I texted my team. I'm like, we have an ink product, And yeah, I just remember driving home going like, that is so cool. Not even from like, I mean, it's cool to use algae and make the print, but I just go like these interactions are cool, right? Yeah. Like when you start to work with a designer who's got a completely different skill set than you. combining those two, like that's where that magic happens, and that's what gets me like excited.
No doubt, no doubt, because that's where like it's taking these sort of like seemingly different spheres of, say, business in this case, like that, like
Yeah,
the crossover you wouldn't necessarily consider right off the bat. But then when you start thinking about it, like, well, yeah, it makes complete sense. And
yeah,
I'm sure there's
yeah,
probably a million other sort of like applications out there that you haven't even considered just yet. And once they sort of like pop into your mind just like that, or like through that
yeah,
experience, it must blow you away. It must sort of
yeah.
like get the juices flowing, if you will.
It's fun, and it makes me just want to like talk to people, right? I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
good things happen when you're at your desk thinking, but I would say 90% of the things that like really move the needle living in, it's all about people, whether it's internal or external, just people communicating, doing things, learning from each other. Like it's
Yeah.
just a lot of interactions.
Yeah, most definitely talking those things out.
Hmm,
Alrighty.
hmm.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing all those stories. Yeah,
Yeah.
we had a triple dose there. That was cool. That's
Yeah.
great. No, that's great. I mean, that's awesome. Yeah, I love it. But we are rounding the bend here, and we're heading into the final segment, and it's something called the crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future. Usually it's trends and predictions. And I have one last question here, and this is kind of centered on our talk. And to be quite honest, I'm sure maybe, well, maybe not in your world necessarily, but at least in mine at times, like there is a lot of doom and gloom when it comes
Mhm,
to, considering the climate crisis, and for good reason, obviously, right? There's a lot of
mhm.
things that are going on still that aren't, that aren't really taking into account just
Yeah,
the moment that we're in and the changes that we
yeah,
need to make. There's still a lot of
yeah.
companies that are still following that sort of status quo. They're not using the
Mhm,
science. They're not using a lot of these evolving technologies.
yeah.
So it's been, quite frankly, like really refreshing. Like most of our talk, I think, has been more on that side of positivity and,
Yeah,
a lot
yeah,
of hope and everything else. But that's
yeah,
super important too. Like it's
yeah,
so easy to
yeah,
get caught
yeah,
up in this doom and gloom. So
yeah.
keeping, with the theme of this talk, I mean, what gives you, I guess, the most hope and optimism moving forward? And based off what you're seeing, based off these conversations that you've had with all these people, whether it's within your team or at conferences or elsewhere, and your background in science, what fuels this optimism for you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think what fuels the optimism is, I know there's a lot of great stuff going on in science. I know there's a lot of scientists who are driving hard. I think there's probably, I don't know the statistics, but I mean, there's got to be, I mean, it just seems like there's a lot of entrepreneurship going on, and that includes spinouts out of universities. I mean, there's really a focus on this. It's like not about even just like a for-profit business, but just getting things out in the world. Like I think there's probably more focus on that right now than there's been in my 15, 20 years of being in academia or in the science world. That's encouraging from a technology standpoint and kind of an application standpoint. I think what gives me the most hope is that like people are like talking about it. Like I open up like the New York Times, and it's just like every day there seems like there's like a conversation on climate and really thinking about the facts. And like I don't think that was the case 5 years ago as
Mhm.
much, right? There was always these higher level topics coming up and things like that. So um, I think the fact that people are talking about it is good. And then, again, these interactions with brands, like I interact with people that like really do care, and they are people who like understand that they want things to be done differently. Sometimes they it's difficult in the system that they're in or things like that. But when you have enough of these people who are like, I believe in this and I want to do it, I think that like the Nike t-shirts is a great example of like like you have people who are like, I'm not I'm not going to go work with the large ink company that's going to deliver perfectly on time and they're going to be easy. I want to work with this company that's doing really difficult things and work with them to help them get this out. Like to me,
Yeah.
that's a really promising and hopeful kind of indicator of how things are going. And that, Nike's obviously one of the biggest apparel brands in the world. So if they're doing things like that, I can only imagine what they'll be doing in the next 5, 10 years, and then what these other groups will be doing. Let alone the Patagonias of the world, right? Who
Right.
are you can drop off clothes, they fix it, they'll let it's just like they're setting these trends that are
Yeah.
people like it. I think they're becoming way more. They're driving revenue because everyone's like, I love what you're doing, I love
Right.
what your mission's about, right? So
Hmm.
more and more of that, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And really quickly, I'd just like to add as well, in terms of Nike, I mean, it's great what they're doing and the experience that you explained of working with them right now. But also too, it's interesting how like if they adopt this, that automatically puts pressure on all these other companies in their sphere as well, that they've got to follow suit now. Like
Yeah,
whether they want to or
yeah,
not at
yeah.
times, it really does put pressure
Yeah,
on them
yeah,
too, which is,
yeah,
again,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
that
yeah,
type of pressure is probably a good thing, right? That's what we
yeah,
need.
yeah,
We need this
yeah.
full
So
adoption for it to
some of
really.
it's like a domino effect, right? Like one group uses it, and then the phrase we always have in these kind of innovator circles is nobody wants to be first,
Yeah.
and nobody wants to be third. Everyone loves to be second because it's like, hey, you de-risked it,
Yeah,
but
totally.
hey, I get to tell the
I'm
story,
still,
right?
yeah, an early adopter. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So, I think that, again, even if it's a small Patagonia, 10,000 prints, like, enough of those with these different technologies, it starts to change exactly what you said, puts pressure on other groups to say, this is real. There's really no excuse not to adopt this for various product lines.
Yeah, yeah. Well said.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this has been a really fun talk, Scott. I really enjoyed
Yeah.
it. I mean, you've shared a lot of insights, a lot of stories, and I think listeners are really going to enjoy it, kind of give them a different perspective. And the thing that struck me over the course of this talk as well, I've already brought this up once, but, is more on the positive side of things, where we didn't go so deeply into the doom and gloom, which I think also is incredibly important to do, right? It's too easy to go down that path. There's enough evidence of what we're doing wrong. It's nice to focus on all the good things and what we're doing right, and to feel a little optimistic moving forward. So yeah, thanks so much for taking some time and coming on the show.
I appreciate it. It's good to share the optimism and the realism, and I think good things are happening. They got to happen faster, but it really is. It is happening, so it's good.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem at all. Well, for those interested in learning more about Scott and his work, you can find him on LinkedIn. He's also on Instagram. His company, Living Ink Technologies, on Instagram, Twitter, all the major social platforms. And of course, you can go to his website, Living Ink Technologies. And for reference, all this information will be included in the show notes. Also, too, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. I mean, I think it's a great thing when we learn a little bit more about one another, the stresses, the joys, the pressures, all of that stuff. I mean, I think it allows for empathy to take place, and it lessens that divide or tribalism, if you will. Also, to be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And finally, head on over to YouTube. We recently launched a channel over there where you can check full video episodes of conversations like the ones we had today with Scott. And the interesting thing here is that there will be a slideshow of imagery associated with the talk, which can add a different layer of perhaps enjoyment to all of it. If you do go over there, you'll notice we do need a bit of love. Hit that subscribe button. It'll help more than you can know. And then finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions around the world. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.